we can have a respectful difference of opinion without meaning that we are evil or corporate shills, or we have no concern for our fellow human beings, or we're opposed to affordable housing. None of that is the case, and I am tired of that being the narrative that I hear coming. And so I'm going to stop because I'm losing my temper.
Well, some tension heating up in council chambers this week. Councilmember Kathy Moore getting angry and calling out Councilmember Tammy Morales, feeling vilified, she says, over a recent piece of affordable housing legislation. So what do we got here? Tempest in a teapot, indication of something else? We're going to talk about what's cooking there. Plus, a new public safety plan from the mayor of Seattle, a new twist in the effort to revise the minimum wage for delivery drivers in Seattle, plus a whole lot more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine, all mine, and I'm joined by my co-host, David Croman. He is the City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I got to ask, you took this inaugural trip on the light rail on the east side a few days ago. What is it like?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, you're so used to just taking the one line. It's funny to hear the person over the intercom talk about the two line.
Yes, right.
Right. The event was, it was packed. There's lots of people on the trains. I could not find anybody that I talked to who planned on using the isolated East Side line very often. Everybody I talked to talked about, how great it'll be once it's finally connected to Seattle.
Okay.
The atmosphere was festive nonetheless.
I'll take festive. That's how we get progress here. Well, thank you, David. Thanks also to our patrons. A big shout out to Callie, longtime patron of the show. Callie, thank you for your continued support. Become a patron, folks. If you can, we will answer your questions on the show. How about that? We'll give you access to patrons first content before anybody else, and a handy decal too, all for $5 a month, $1.25 a show. Come on now, what a deal. Find the show on Patreon at Seattle News, Views, and Brews. A big thanks also to Converge Media. The video version of this podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get going. Time for Right Here, Right Now. David, I was all set and ready to let it go with this connected communities legislation that Councilmember Morales brought up in her land use committee a couple of weeks ago. That committee rejected this with 3 no votes. Morales said yes, Strauss abstained. But here we go into this week, and Councilmember Kathy Moore says she's feeling vilified, labeled as a corporate shill by Councilmember Morales for voting no on this legislation. I know that Councilmember Morales was unhappy about not getting support for her bill. I talked to her about this on Seattle Channel just a couple of weeks ago. But I never heard her use those words like a shill or a corporate, any of those kind of things. I haven't been able to find these words anywhere else. Have you been able to figure out what's going on here?
No, she didn't use the word. She didn't call anyone evil. She didn't use the words corporate shill. I think that was a bit of projection. It's interesting. Those are words that Councilmember Shama-Sawant would have used, but and I think for some people, Councilmember Morales has sort of become the new Councilmember Sawant.
Oh boy!
In reality, she's not that, and doesn't use that kind of language, and didn't hear. I think the frustration from Moore was, I think Councilmember Morales in some of her comments sort of implied that she cared more about affordable housing than some of her other colleagues. Right. I think that's what was frustrating to Moore and some of the other people. But, slightly ironic to decry the names you're being called while, saying things that didn't appear to have actually happened.
Yeah.
But, a peek into the tension, I think that is there. And there's this overarching kind of drive by this new city council to be seen as more civil and more, more professional, I suppose, which ironically now I think twice has kind of made it seem a little more chaotic. There was the time when the people were arrested at City Hall, and now there's this where there's kind of open public fighting between council members. So, it's a government. There's always going to be some fighting because people care about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we're recording this show just as the council is taking up a vote on this legislation about connected communities from Councilmember Morales. Doesn't look like it's going to go through, which everybody had thought would be the case here. Some amendments tried and failed here. I know a lot of people are saying, hey, we need some more time with this. but it has been in the works for 2+ years. I guess it's just for me looking at this as a new council is coming in here and trying to engage with these different ideas. This felt like a bit of a rush to them to talk about this different type of program when they're dealing with so many other things, like a new housing levy coming online, like a new comprehensive plan they're supposed to work on. Talk to me about that, about where this connected communities legislation, I guess, just fell short with this new council.
Yeah, I mean, they had a lot of concerns. I mean, I think what we heard a lot is basically it doesn't do exactly what we think it could or should do. Was something that came up a bunch. And then, you know, also that we shouldn't be having this conversation separate from the conversation around the comprehensive plan, which is ongoing. But, you know, I mean, I think to an extent, it was also a victim of Councilmember Morales introducing this really early on this year, when most of the rest of the other council members were still getting briefings basically on what their departments were doing. So, it's interesting. I mean, this bill had a lot of support from affordable housing developers. They showed up in public comment today. But, you know, I think it just didn't win over the council members who weren't maybe entirely ready for this conversation yet, and left not feeling convinced that it was going to do what they wanted it to do. So here we are.
Yeah, I know. A lot of interesting back and forth on this. And I know affordable housing is important to every single council member, but the execution of it, this pilot program didn't appear to be the way they wanted to go with this. So we'll keep on looking at this. I know this is something that Councilmember Morales put a lot of work into over the past couple of years. But I do want to talk about something new that is coming out of the mayor's office here this week. Mayor Harold is kicking off a series of public meetings where he is unveiling a new public safety framework, as he is calling it here. First meeting at Garfield High School this week, then moving around the police precincts to get feedback from the larger community. Full disclosure, I am moderating these events at the request of the mayor's office. Come by and say hi if you're dropping by one of these forums here. So we're at a little bit, David, I think the plan before the plan stage here. The mayor says he's going to be incorporating public feedback into what he is calling this overall One Seattle safety framework. And I was struck by the number of agencies that are coming to these events, David, at least this one at Garfield High School, not just police and fire, but Department of Transportation, the city attorney's office, juvenile division, human services, 14 agencies in all showing up to Garfield. I just wanted to ask you about this overall effort to bring all these agencies to the table, have this interactive kind of an event. I know people are going to want to talk to police, but I think there's a real push to talk to other department heads and other agencies that are involved here. What do you think about that process, what the mayor's trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. He's sort of trying to show that public safety can mean many things. You know, for example, lots of people see traffic safety as public safety. You know, if people are getting hit and killed by cars, that's an unsafe environment. Although the kind of default definition tends to be police and fire. So, you know, I mean, I think also maybe an acknowledgement that the police department isn't going to be in a place to the place that it used to be for a long time. You can say you want to grow the police department, but it's going to be slow going even to get it back to where it was in 2019. So, you know, sort of trying to create an environment where it's not just the Seattle Police Department's responsibility to handle public safety; it's everybody's. You know, spreads the responsibility around a little bit.
Yeah, I think so too. And the mayor says he is working on these 6 key strategies for public safety. I will summarize them here for you folks. He wants to, 1, reduce gun violence and other violent crime with evidence-based solutions and enforcement strategies. Wants to respond to 911 calls efficiently by hiring more officers and diversifying response options. Okay. Number 3, address the root causes and impacts of violence by investing in community-based solutions and upstream interventions. All right. Number 4, prioritize a public health and trauma-informed approach to reduce overdoses, reduce violence, and support victims and survivors. All right, there we go with number 5 now. Coordinate community safety efforts to avoid duplication and inefficiencies. Breaking down silos is what he's talking about. And then finally, build and maintain community trust through strong accountability systems and community engagement on law enforcement priorities. So essentially, he wants it all here, David. And I just wanted to ask you 2 things, I guess. Anything jump out at you with that list? And how do you see the city of Seattle actually accomplishing some of these goals, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because it's not like you can just throw money at the problem, as we've talked about.
Because they don't have it, yeah.
The money's not really there. I mean, these conversations around public safety. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know a great answer to that, if I'm being honest.
I wish I did too, but it just seems again like
I know.
that plan before the plan piece. And I guess it's that budget thing that's staring me right in the face, because when you're talking about $250 million budget deficit, it doesn't allow for a lot of aspirational thinking, I guess, like this is kind of where I'm coming from.
No, and a lot of the budget that, we just talked about how wanting to broaden out the kind of holistic approach to public safety, but what budget is there is probably going to go towards giving police officers more money.
Yep. We're going to talk about that.
Maybe we'll talk about that later. But so it's a tough time. It's a tough time to start new things and have new agenda items, because you're going to have to work with the resources you have, and there just frankly aren't that many of them.
Very true. Very true. All right. Well, up next, revisiting some of the changes that Council President Sarah Nelson wants to bring to delivery driver wages. Some legislation starting to take shape here. David's written about it. We're going to learn a little bit more about it on Now Hear This. Well, Council President Sarah Nelson is proposing some changes to the way delivery drivers get paid in the city of Seattle. The council passed a measure last year called Pay Up that increased those wages to about 133% of minimum wage, with some new per minute and per mile fees. But when this went into effect of January of this year, many apps slapped on a $5 fee on top of their orders, at which Council President Nelson says she's been getting the messages coming into the council that drivers, restaurants were getting a lot fewer orders and didn't like it.
Based on what we were hearing and seeing in our email boxes and in the survey, I felt a moral obligation to do something about it. And if that wasn't going to be repealing the legislation as urged by drivers and restaurants and customers, then at least try to fix it.
David, I thought the council president last week went to great pains to point out she is not repealing this measure. She just wants to reduce the payments such that this would reflect Seattle's minimum wage of $19.97. But I know there's a lot more to this, and I wanted to talk about some of your reporting on this. Is this going to help us reach the goal of cheaper deliveries, these tweaks that Council President Nelson is talking about? Will this help with driver pay? What can you tell us?
It's hard to say. I mean, so the proposed changes, it doesn't require that these fees be rolled back, but we did hear from Instacart. So she said something publicly, and it took a little bit to confirm this, but Instacart has apparently already committed to getting rid of its delivery fee if this bill passes. So, it probably would lead to cheaper deliveries, at least from Instacart. And if Instacart does it, I think it would be tough for DoorDash or some of the other companies to not. Of course, those companies do different things, but still, they I'm sure they talk to each other, they work together. And so, I think it could, but, the question is about what that means for drivers. So I do think that the frustration that a lot of drivers are feeling right now is real. And you hear that from both sides of the equation on this, that they're hearing from members and drivers that are waiting longer for rides and not getting as good tips. That's not across the board. I talked to one guy who said he's making more money than he ever has. I think for some companies, for Amazon Flex, or a company that presets your route for you, so you're guaranteed to be out, this is a great bill for you because there's no question that you're going to have work. But the ideal sort of sweet spot that people want is, enough wages that people are getting paid fairly, but not so much that it kind of craters the entire industry. And at the same time, this is giving the companies basically, a lot of what they want. And they had actually pushed to go further, it seems like. But so maybe didn't get everything they wanted. But, I think the tough part for the backers of this legislation in particular is it has not been in effect for very long at all.
Right. So has there been a lot of information to come in to figure out its actual impact? Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. And some folks that I've talked to have said that, the deliveries really cratered early on, but there might be some signals that they're kind of creeping back up as people are sort of getting used to the idea. Maybe with sticker shock at first, and then they say, you know what, I really don't want to get up today, and I'll just pay the extra $5 or whatever it might be. And so I think that the big frustration by backers is that this law hasn't been given the time to kind of come into maturity. But Councilmember Nelson will counter that for the people who jobs are being affected right now. It's important that they act quickly. And,
yeah.
I expect the current schedule puts this on, late May passage. I would expect that to hold, plus or minus a week or so.
Yeah. That I think that May 21st date is what they're looking at, and we'll see if that one hits. But I did want to talk about that. The original backers of the bill, Working Washington. I feel like I haven't heard a lot from that group. Are they at the table in this mix here in terms of trying to hash out what this bill is going to look like? Maybe make some tweaks to it, changes to it. Do you understand who's at the table with this one, David, and who is really negotiating this?
Yeah, the Working Washington is not at the table on this one. I don't think they were invited to the table. I'm also not sure that they would have accepted the invitation. I mean, Working Washington's position is the legislation needs more time, and we don't support changes. I suppose there's a reality in which they say, okay, as long as it's not a full repeal, we're willing to listen to some amendments. But it's never been that organization's MO. They're pretty strident in their positions usually because they believe they're the correct ones.
Yeah.
So the people at the negotiating table have been the companies, and then this group to Forward, which is has company members on the board and gets money from some of the companies. So some people see them as just basically an extension of the companies. I don't actually think that's right because in the negotiations, they've actually been the ones who have pushed back the hardest on full repeal. The companies would love to fully repeal this thing, and the group Drive Forward has resisted that and resisted calls from the companies to totally eliminate per mile reimbursement. So that's still in there in part because of the Drive Forward company, organization. But again, if you're a backer of this bill, it's not a great look. It doesn't feel great to you to see that the people at the negotiating table are either the companies or have direct ties to the companies.
Yeah, that's definitely a challenging piece of that, and I'll be interested to see where this goes because I'm with you. I'm listening to this different public comment, and you're hearing a lot of people saying, "Hey, change it or don't change it." There's a lot of chatter on this one, and I think it'll continue here through the month of May, if indeed it is passed by the end of May, as Council President Nelson is planning. So we'll keep our ears on that one for you folks. But I did want to talk about, David, some news with you that we alluded to earlier. This materialized late last week. SPOG, the Seattle Police Officers Guild, the SPD's largest union, which includes these rank and file officers, approved a new contract with retroactive raises. So now they'll be the highest paid officers in the state, starting off at more than $100,000 in terms of salary. They're getting a 23% retroactive pay raise. And I know, David, we touched on this recently. This agreement is only for the years through 2023. I'm trying to figure out what happens next. Is there any impetus to talk about these years, 2024 onward, or where are we with this?
Yeah, it's strange because it is they're admitting this is a partial contract. So it's not even that they passed a contract that expires completely. It's that they in some ways didn't even bother to get it all the way through 2024. Honestly, I don't know where it goes from here because so like you said, it gives pretty significant wage increases dating back to 2021. That was obviously a big priority to the city council, who feel like they're under pressure to start showing results on police recruitment immediately. The problem here is that there's a federal judge who's going to be looking at this thing and will have some opinions on whether or not it goes far enough in creating accountability systems for police officers. And I think the fact that it's a partial agreement is, no one said this exactly, but it's pretty much an acknowledgement that this contract is not going to satisfy the federal judge's demands. And the press release yesterday that the mayor's office put out kind of alluded to this, saying, but in this year, we're back at the negotiating table and we're going to really push forward on some more proposed accountability changes that will make Judge James Robart happy. Yeah. Again, the implication being the ones that are in the contract now are not going to make him happy.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
And so, it's a tough situation though, because they're going to write big checks to all these police officers. They're going to be happy and they're highest paid in the state now. I think that their urgency to get something done is kind of out the window right now. And the police union, as we've talked about before, is not a party to the lawsuit that brought the consent decree to town. So they're not obligated to do anything to keep the federal judge happy, unless somebody wants to sue the Seattle Police Officers Guild and bring them into federal court, which of course would be its own sticky wicket. And so, I don't know what the plan is here. There was some rumor that the plan is basically to declare an impasse and have somebody else come in and sort it out and just do this entirely through third-party mediation and whatnot. Other than that, I don't know what you do, save for James Robart just kind of throwing up his hands and saying, "Good enough," which, if we know anything about him, is not likely.
Doubtful. Yeah, this consent decree, which we're alluding to here with federal judge James Robart overseeing what's going on here when it comes to accountability for police. This is something that's been going on since 2012. And this accountability piece specifically doesn't seem to have an end in sight. And there's one little, actually relatively major piece of language, David, that you keyed in on in writing about this that I thought was very interesting. This whole idea about disciplining officers. Apparently, the city must take into account, at least this is the way the agreement is written now, must take into account whether, quote, the alleged offense is stigmatizing to a law enforcement officer, making it difficult for the employee to get other law enforcement employment. And I'm just trying to figure out, how do you determine that with regard to, okay, is this stigma? Is there like a stigma scale that we're looking at here that different departments would look at when it comes to what it means to discipline an officer? This one is a real head scratcher for me.
Yeah, that's tough language, and it's explicitly, we know that standard is higher than a preponderance of evidence, which is because that's laid out in the contract, and that's kind of this more standard, I suppose, standard for firing somebody. Yeah, but we don't know how much higher than preponderance of evidence that is. And I think the big thing here is that contract, leaving it vague in that way, just gives a lot of wiggle room for challenging discipline in arbitration, in the courts, and would seem to put a lot of power in the hands of people who are not the city of Seattle or Seattle Police Department leadership. And that I think is kind of tough, will be tough to swallow for the judge. I mean, we know, because that was in the last contract too. And, he raised that as an issue, and still there, they're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah. And no, it did seem like maybe a little bit more power in the hands of the chief, like the arbitrator has to listen to the chief in terms of his or her decisions when it comes to discipline. But then is that undercut by the statement here about stigmatizing to a law enforcement officer? That seems like those two pieces are married together too.
And I don't know, I'm not a lawyer here, and we're, on a tight deadline, but I don't know that how much power the city has to deal with that. I mean, some of that, a lot of that is state stuff,
right?
And the legislature has a good point. This legislature has talked about changing arbitration, the power of our arbitration, but has always backed off because, funny enough, the rest of the labor world, though not always fully supportive of the police labor world, is scared of making that change also. And so, that to me, and I think there's some vagary in that language too. So I don't know how much that actually does, but that additional language is clearly a nod to Robart and his concerns. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll keep track of that one, David. Thank you for the reporting on that one. Coming up next, a budget review just for you. We're talking about what the council's working on here. Hundreds of pages going into a review of the budget. This coming from Budget Chair Dan Strauss. We're talking about it coming up on What's Next. David, you just put out a piece about the budget that the council, they really dug in on this week. We're talking about a 200-page review of the budget from Budget Chair Dan Strauss. He definitely gave a nod to all those people who are saying, hey, we want an audit. He said, this could very well seem like an audit because that's what it seems like to me. But the bottom line I drew was that the revenue coming into the city used to outstrip inflation over the past few years, but that has not been the case recently. Can you talk about those macro issues here in terms of what's going on with the budget and what the city's wrestling with right now? Yeah, I mean, the big thing is it was just really cheap to do stuff for most of a decade, and that period lined up with a time when the city was growing by leaps and bounds, and so it's pretty easy for the city to grow its research, its departments, its government generally to kind of
yes.
answer that. So they, it grew, the city government grew quite a bit. And they could handle it just fine because they were bringing in way more revenue than inflation. And so the budget grew fairly easily. Now, now they're in a situation where they're have the government the size that it is. And, kind of getting into the nuances of which pieces are working and which are not is a much kind of longer and more complicated exercise than what's done here.
Sure.
But, at the end of the day, there are a lot of workers who are represented by unions and have fought for fair wages and have done decently in negotiations, and therefore the salaries are just the cost of having all these people on the payroll has gone up quite a bit, combined with just sort of general inflation on a lot of things. That basically accounts for like 80% of the budget growth that we've seen. There have also been some additional policy, some extra additional policies funded by the city that have grown the budget as well. But, at the end of the day, it's the government grew at a time when it was really cheap to have money. And now sustaining that is more difficult when inflation is what it is and revenues have continued to dive.
That is tough. And does this give any more fire to the idea of trying to bring in sources of new revenue? I know that's been a little bit of an anathema for this current council that's come in, but any push towards that, or more thoughts about that?
Not that I've heard, and I don't think that would necessarily change. This council's been pretty clear from their time on the campaign trail that's kind of their last priority. And I think the fact that the Jumpstart payroll tax, its forecasts have been coming in so much higher. I think if they need an out that is not and like a way out of this that isn't making large cuts, that they would take the payroll tax route by using that to plug the hole rather than going out and bringing in new revenue, would be my guess.
Yeah, it sounds like an interesting time for them, but I just don't see a lot of council members really willing to make that jump. That's kind of what I've heard over the last couple of weeks, certainly.
Yeah, that's true. And also, that's unless they want to make the payroll tax bigger, which I doubt they would want to do, the question of like what that new revenue, where that new revenue would come from. I mean, that could open up legal questions, and that would be a pretty lengthy discussion that I think, even if they were interested in it, I'm not sure it would solve the problem this year.
Yeah. And I know it's interesting to see this process start so early. Normally it is something that's happening in September, going into November when they actually write the budget there. So there's a lot still ahead on this one, and I appreciate the back and forth, David, but I do need to wrap it up with you. And I have been excited to watch the Mariners stay in first place in the AL West, but then this interesting thing happened where the Atlanta Braves came to town, and oh yeah, Jared Kelenic came back to town too. And I saw you post about this. It's not like I'm cheering for the guy, I'm not booing for the guy. It's just, yeah, good for you. I hope it works out in your career. It was just an interesting thing to see that one-time lauded superstar of the Mariners come back into town, and I didn't quite know how to react.
Yeah, I know. I mean, and he's kind of put foot in his mouth a couple times and done some dumb things. So there's got a little bit of
against
like
the water cooler too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So he's got like a little bit of a villain arc, but at the same time, he's always plays super hard, and he clearly cared. And he was obviously frustrated he didn't do as better with Seattle. So I feel fairly neutral toward him. I mean, the only thing I feel negatively when I think about him is the fact that this Mariners had to trade him just to dump salary. I wish. Yeah, I wasn't opposed to them trading him. I wish they could have just gotten more than salary relief for him. Yeah,
that's all it turns into sometimes with this squad. Well, David, thank you for joining me once again. Thanks to everybody who is listening to this episode of Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks especially to patrons who support the show. If you would like to be a patron, why not? Do it. Find this podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews, and sign on up. $5 a month gets you a whole bunch of things, including these great decals. You can ask us questions, the whole Megillah. So please do that as well. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. And if you do listen, we certainly appreciate it. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2024.